In the desert of northwestern Saudi Arabia, where the sandstone mountains meet the flat plains of the Hejaz and the air is dry enough to preserve almost anything left exposed to it, there is a city of the dead. The tombs are cut into the faces of the sandstone outcrops that rise from the desert floor in isolated masses, some of them 30 and 40 meters tall, their surfaces worn by wind and sand into shapes that have no parallel in any other landscape. Into these outcrops, 2,000 years ago, the Nabataean people carved their most elaborate and most permanent monuments. Not temples, not palaces, not the administrative buildings of a functioning state. They carved tombs, rock-cut facades of extraordinary sophistication, their columns and pilasters and pediments and friezes executed with the precision of trained stone carvers working in a tradition that combined the visual vocabulary of the classical Mediterranean world with something that was distinctively and recognizably their own. More than 100 of these tomb facades survive at Hegra, scattered across the sandstone outcrops and the open desert between them. They range from the simple and relatively modest to the monumental and elaborately decorated, from single-chamber tombs that served a single family to multi-chamber complexes that could accommodate dozens of interments. The largest and most elaborate of them, concentrated on the outcrops that the Nabataeans designated as the prestige burial ground of the city, are among the most impressive rock-cut monuments in the ancient world, comparable in their craftsmanship and their ambition to the great tombs of Petra, the Nabataean capital in what is now southern Jordan, and in some respects more striking because they are less visited and less known. The city that these tombs served, the residential and commercial and administrative settlement of the living whose dead were buried here, has largely vanished. The mud brick and timber structures of the domestic and commercial quarters of ancient Hegra did not survive the 2 millennia of desert conditions in the way that the rock-cut tombs did. What survives of the living city is mostly archaeological, buried walls and floors and the material culture of occupation that survives in the soil. But the tombs, cut into the permanent rock and sealed against the desert air, have come through 2,000 years in a state of preservation that makes them unique among the monuments of the ancient Arabian peninsula. The Nabataeans who built Hegra were one of the most remarkable civilizations of the ancient world, and one of the least known outside the specialist community of archaeologists and ancient historians who study the pre-Islamic Arabian Peninsula. Their story begins in the 4th century before the Common Era, when they first appear in the historical sources as a nomadic people living in the deserts of what is now Jordan and northwestern Saudi Arabia. Within 3 centuries, they had built one of the most sophisticated trading empires in the ancient world, controlling the incense routes that carried the luxury goods of southern Arabia and the Indian Ocean trade to the markets of the Mediterranean. Their capital at Petra was a city of extraordinary architectural achievement. Their secondary capital at Hegra, more than 500 kilometers to the south, was a city of extraordinary funerary achievement. And then, in 106 of the Common Era, the Roman Emperor Trajan annexed their kingdom, and within a few generations the distinctively Nabataean culture that had produced both cities had disappeared, absorbed into the broader culture of the Roman Near East. The landscape of Hegra is one of the most visually dramatic in the Arabian Peninsula, and understanding the site begins with understanding the geology and the geography that shaped both the physical character of the monuments and the strategic importance of the location. The region of northwestern Saudi Arabia, known today as the Al-Yala Valley, within which Hegra is located, is a landscape of dramatic contrast. Narrow agricultural valleys cut through the surrounding plateau by ancient watercourses, their floors green with date palms and other cultivated plants, their walls the dark red and orange and cream of layered sandstone rising in cliffs and isolated outcrops that create a landscape of extraordinary visual intensity. The sandstone of the region is ancient, deposited in successive layers over hundreds of millions of years, and the differential erosion of these layers by wind and the occasional flash flood has produced the characteristic forms of the desert landscape. Flat-topped mesas, isolated pinnacles, and the rounded masses of the jebels, the sandstone mountains, that provide the canvases on which the Nabataean tomb carvers worked. The sandstone itself has properties that made it ideal for the kind of monumental rock-cut architecture that the Nabataeans practiced. It is soft enough to be worked with iron tools relatively easily, but it is hard enough to hold fine carved detail for centuries, and the faces of the outcrops exposed to the dry desert air develop a harder surface crust over time that protects the carved detail beneath it from the wind erosion that would eventually obliterate it. The combination of workability, durability, and the natural visual drama of the outcrops made the sandstone landscape of the Hejaz an ideal medium for the kind of monument that the Nabataeans wanted to create. The strategic importance of the Hegra location within the regional geography of the ancient world derived from its position on the incense route, the network of overland trading paths that connected the frankincense and myrrh-producing regions of southern Arabia and the Dhofar coast of what is now Oman with the markets of the Mediterranean world. Frankincense and myrrh were among the most valuable commodities in the ancient world, used in religious ritual throughout the Mediterranean and the Near East, consumed in enormous quantities by the temples and the wealthy households of the Roman and Hellenistic world, and produced exclusively in a limited region of southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa. The camel caravans that transported these goods northward, along the routes that followed the wadis and the water sources of the Hejaz, had to pass through the Hegra area on their way from the production zones of the south to the consumption markets of the north, and the Nabataean city that controlled this passage was positioned to levy taxes and provide services to the caravans that were the foundation of its economic life. The water sources of the Hegra area, sparse by the standards of any temperate landscape but relatively reliable by the standards of the Arabian desert, were a further factor in the strategic importance of the location. The Alula Valley and the Hegra area have a higher water table than much of the surrounding desert, fed by the occasional rains that fall on the surrounding mountains and percolate slowly through the sandstone to emerge as springs and shallow wells in the valley floors. These water sources, modest as they were sufficient to support a permanent agricultural settlement and to provide the reliable watering point that the caravan trade required. The Nabataeans are one of the most intriguing civilizations of the ancient world, partly because of the extraordinary architectural achievements at Petra and Hegra that make their material culture immediately recognizable, and partly because the trajectory of their emergence, their flourishing, and their eventual absorption into the Roman Empire remains incompletely understood. The earliest references to the Nabataeans in ancient sources describe them as a nomadic people living in the desert regions of what is now southwestern Jordan and northwestern Saudi Arabia. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era but drawing on earlier sources, describes an encounter between a Macedonian military expedition and the Nabataeans in the late 4th century before the Common Era, in which the Nabataeans are depicted as a desert people who live without houses, drink no wine, and follow a strict code of mobility and self-sufficiency that allows them to survive in terrain that is hostile to any settled force. This description, whether or not it accurately represents the Nabataeans of the 4th century, captures something real about the nomadic roots of a people who would within a few generations transform themselves into the builders of one of the ancient world's most sophisticated urban civilizations. The mechanism of this transformation is not documented in detail in any surviving ancient source, but the archaeological and historical evidence points to the central role of the incense trade. As the demand for Arabian luxury goods in the Mediterranean world grew during the Hellenistic period, the people best positioned to benefit from that demand were the ones who controlled the desert routes along which those goods traveled. The Nabataeans, with their knowledge of the desert, their access to the water sources along the routes, and their existing network of relationships with the nomadic groups that populated the region, were ideally positioned to make themselves indispensable to the caravan trade. The transition from nomadic pastoralists who raided caravans to sedentary traders who facilitated and taxed them was not an instantaneous transformation, but a gradual process driven by the economic logic of a situation in which controlling the trade routes was more profitable than disrupting them. By the 2nd century before the Common Era, the Nabataeans had established a kingdom centered on Petra, the extraordinary rock-cut city in the mountains of what is now southern Jordan, and had begun the process of building the administrative, commercial, and cultural institutions of a state. Their territory extended from the Sinai Peninsula and the Negev Desert in the northwest to the Hejaz in the southeast, encompassing the key water sources and the most important segments of the overland trade routes. Their capital at Petra grew to become a city of perhaps 30,000 inhabitants, with monumental architecture, an active artistic and craft production tradition, a sophisticated water management system of cisterns and conduits, and a political and diplomatic presence in the affairs of the Near Eastern world that was recognized and sometimes feared by both the Seleucid Empire to the north and the Ptolemaic Empire to the northwest. Hegra was established as a Nabataean center relatively early in the development of the kingdom, perhaps as early as the 2nd century before the Common Era, though the period of its greatest development and the construction of the major tomb monuments was concentrated in the 1st century before the Common Era and the 1st century of the Common Era. Its position as the southernmost major Nabataean city, at the far end of the kingdom from the capital at Petra, gave it a specific character. It was the gateway between the Nabataean heartland and the Arabian peninsula to the south, the last Nabataean city before the caravan routes entered the more uncertain political geography of Central Arabia. The tombs of Hegra are the most visible and most studied evidence of the Nabataean presence at the site, and their architectural character is the starting point for understanding what the Nabataeans were trying to achieve when they carved them. The basic form of the Hegra tomb facade is derived from the architectural vocabulary of the Hellenistic and Roman Mediterranean world, but it is deployed in ways that reflect Nabataean artistic sensibility and Nabataean funerary beliefs rather than simply copying the architecture of the dominant Mediterranean cultures. The facade typically consists of a doorway flanked by pilasters or columns, surmounted by a decorative entablature and a pediment or stepped crown, the whole carved from the living rock of the sandstone outcrop and sometimes reaching heights of 15 or 20 meters from the base to the top of the decorative crown. The surface of the facade is covered with carved ornamental details, Medusa heads and eagles and Nabataean deities in the roundels and panels of the entablature, stylized vegetation and geometric patterns in the moldings, and the dedicatory inscription that identifies the tomb owner and specifies the legal conditions of the burial rite above the doorway. The inscriptions are one of the most important sources of information about Hegra and about the social world that produced the tombs. Written in the Nabataean script, which is the ancestor of the Arabic script used to write Arabic today, these inscriptions record the names and titles of the tomb owners, the names of the deities whose protection was invoked for the burial, the dates of construction in the Nabataean calendar, and often quite detailed legal provisions governing who had the right to be buried in the tomb and what penalties would be imposed on anyone who violated those rights. Reading these inscriptions is the closest we can come to hearing the voices of the people who built the tombs, and what those voices tell us is a picture of a society that was deeply invested in the legal definition of property rights, including the property rights of the dead. The specific architectural forms used in the Hegra tomb facades can be traced to several different cultural traditions. The classical columns and pilasters and entablatures reflect the influence of Hellenistic architectural practice, which had spread across the Near East in the centuries following Alexander the Great's conquests. The stepped crown, which appears on many of the Hegra facades and on the famous treasury facade at Petra, is a form that may have roots in the architectural traditions of the ancient Near East, including the Assyrian and Achaemenid Persian traditions that preceded the Hellenistic period in the region. The specific combination of these elements, and the ways in which they are modified and adapted to Nabataean purposes, is distinctively Nabataean, a synthesis that created something new from borrowed materials, which is perhaps the most accurate description of what the Nabataean civilization did more broadly. The sequence of tomb construction at Hegra can be traced through the dated inscriptions, which allow a rough chronology of the major monuments to be established. The earliest dated tombs are from the mid-1st century before the Common Era, and the latest from the early 1st century of the Common Era, with the most intensive period of construction concentrated in the decades around the turn of the era. This chronology means that the great tomb facades were being carved at roughly the same time that the Roman world was moving from the late Republic to the early Empire, a period of enormous political and economic significance for the Mediterranean world and for the Nabataean kingdom that traded with it. The social world that produced the tombs of Hegra was one of considerable complexity, and the inscriptions, the archaeological remains of the living city, and the comparison with what is known about Nabataean society at Petra together allow a partial reconstruction of what life at Hegra was like in the 1st century before and after the Common Era. The tomb inscriptions indicate that the right to be buried in a given tomb was a valuable property right, heritable and transferable, that was protected by legal sanction and by the invocation of divine punishment for violations. The formulas used to describe who could be buried in a tomb, and what should happen to anyone who buried an unauthorized person, are remarkably consistent across the Hegra corpus, suggesting that there was a standard legal form for tomb dedication that was broadly understood and widely applied. The deities invoked to protect the burial rites were the Nabataean gods, primarily Dushara and Aulat, and the penalties specified for violation of tomb rites included financial fines and the curse of the god, both of which were presumably effective deterrents in the religious and social context of the 1st century Nabataean community. The names and titles recorded in the inscriptions give a partial picture of the social composition of the Hegra community. The tomb owners include men and women, suggesting that women could hold property rights in Nabataean society that were sufficient to commission and dedicate a major funerary monument. The titles recorded suggest a community that included military officers, civic administrators, and individuals involved in the caravan trade that was the economic foundation of the city. Some inscriptions record family relationships that span multiple generations, providing glimpses of the social networks and the family structures that organized everyday life in the ancient city. The archaeological evidence for the living city of Hegra, while less complete than the funerary evidence, provides important context for the social picture that the inscriptions suggest. Excavations at the site have revealed the remains of a civic center with public buildings and spaces, residential quarters of varying degrees of prosperity, and the commercial infrastructure of a city that was a significant stop on the international caravan trade. The evidence for craft production at the site, including pottery manufacture and the working of stone and metal, suggests a community with a significant artisan population that produced goods both for local consumption and for the regional market. The water management infrastructure of Hegra, which was a prerequisite for the maintenance of any permanent settlement in this desert environment, was sophisticated by the standards of the ancient world. The Nabataeans were known throughout antiquity for their engineering skill in water management, and the system of cisterns, dams, and conduits that they built at Petra is one of the most studied examples of ancient hydraulic engineering in the Near East. At Hegra, the evidence for similar water management is present in the archaeological record, including the remains of cisterns cut into the rock and the traces of conduits that directed surface runoff into storage facilities. This engineering capacity was not simply a practical necessity but a reflection of the broader Nabataean mastery of the desert environment that was the foundation of their civilization. The religious life of the Nabataean community at Hegra is documented partly through the tomb inscriptions, with their invocations of divine protection and their naming of the gods whose curse would fall on tomb violators, and partly through the physical evidence of cult installations and religious monuments found at the site. The Nabataean religious tradition was a form of polytheism that combined indigenous Arabian religious practices with influences from the wider Near Eastern and Hellenistic Mediterranean world. The two most important deities in the Nabataean pantheon were Dushara and Aulat. Dushara, whose name means the one of the Shera Mountains, the range that forms the backdrop of Petra, was the chief male deity of the Nabataean kingdom, associated with the divine protection of the ruling dynasty and with the mountain landscape that was the heartland of Nabataean territory. Aulat, whose name is the feminine form of the Arabic word for God, was one of the principal female deities, associated with the sky and with protection, and widely worshipped across the Arabian peninsula in forms that varied from place to place. The physical representation of Nabataean deities took forms that are distinctive and sometimes unexpected to modern eyes. In the earlier phases of Nabataean religious practice, the gods were represented not by anthropomorphic images but by standing stones, called betels, simple rectangular blocks of stone that served as the aniconic presence of the deity. This aniconic tradition, in which the divine is represented by a stone rather than a human form, has deep roots in the religious traditions of the ancient Near East and the Arabian Peninsula, and it persisted in Nabataean religious practice even after the Nabataeans had adopted the anthropomorphic artistic conventions of the Hellenistic world for decorative purposes. The tomb facades of Hegra show this hybrid character clearly. The carved eagles and Medusa heads and divine figures that decorate the entablatures reflect Hellenistic artistic influence, while the standing stones found in the cult installations at the site reflect the continuation of the older aniconic tradition. The major cult installations at Hegra, the places where the community gathered for religious ceremonies and where the gods were worshipped through offerings and rituals, were located partly in the open desert landscape around the tomb outcrops and partly within the civic center of the living city. The large number of carved niches found in the sandstone outcrops throughout the site, each designed to hold a betil or a small votive inscription, suggests that the religious life of the community was distributed across the landscape in a way that integrated the sacred and the secular, the funerary and the commercial, in a manner characteristic of ancient Near Eastern religious practice. The relationship between the tombs and the religious life of the community was not limited to the formal invocations recorded in the inscriptions. The practice of visiting the tombs of the dead, of making offerings at the tomb facades on the anniversaries of death and on the major religious festivals of the year, was a central element of the funerary culture of the ancient Near East, and the evidence from Hegra and Petra suggests that this practice was important in Nabataean society. The triclinia, the dining rooms carved adjacent to or into the tombs themselves, were spaces where the living ate ritual meals in proximity to the dead, maintaining the connection between the generations that was a fundamental element of the religious and social life of the ancient world. The Roman annexation of the Nabataean kingdom in 106 of the Common Era is one of the most consequential events in the history of Hegra, and understanding it requires understanding both the circumstances of the annexation and its long-term effects on the city and the civilization that had created it. The Nabataean kingdom had existed in a complex and generally successful relationship with Rome for approximately 2 centuries before the annexation. The Nabataeans were not a military power capable of challenging Rome directly, but they were economically valuable as the controllers of the luxury trade routes that supplied the Roman world with the frankincense and spices and other goods that Roman consumers demanded. The successive Roman emperors who dealt with the Nabataean kings generally found it more profitable to maintain them as client rulers than to absorb their kingdom into the Roman administrative system, and the Nabataean kings generally found it more advantageous to pay tribute and maintain the trading relationship than to provoke a military confrontation they could not win. The specific circumstances that led Trajan to annex the kingdom in 106 are not entirely clear from the surviving sources. The last Nabataean king, Rabel II, had died in 106, and the annexation may have followed naturally from his death if the Roman government decided that the moment was opportune to convert the client kingdom into a directly administered province. Alternatively, there may have been specific factors related to the internal politics of the kingdom after Rabel's death that made direct Roman control attractive or necessary. What is clear is that the annexation was accomplished without significant military resistance, which suggests either that the Nabataean population did not mount organized opposition or that the Roman military presence in the region was sufficient to deter any such opposition before it could form. The immediate effect of the annexation on Hegra was probably less disruptive than might be imagined. The Roman government had a consistent policy of maintaining existing economic infrastructure in newly acquired territories, and the caravan trade that was the foundation of Hegra's economy continued to function under Roman administration much as it had under Nabataean rule. The administrative structures of the Nabataean kingdom were adapted to Roman provincial governance rather than dismantled, and the local population that had managed the trade routes and the civic institutions of the Nabataean cities was largely retained in its existing roles. The longer-term effect of the annexation was more profound, however. The specifically Nabataean cultural tradition, including the Nabataean script and language, the distinctive Nabataean architectural and artistic forms, and the Nabataean religious practices, gradually gave way to the broader culture of the Roman Near East over the course of the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era. The Nabataean script was replaced by the Aramaic script and eventually by the early Arabic script that developed from it. The Nabataean language gave way to Aramaic and then to Arabic as the spoken language of the region. The distinctive Nabataean tomb facades continued to be carved for perhaps a generation or two after the annexation, but new construction gradually ceased and the living city of Hegra contracted and eventually disappeared as the population dispersed or relocated to other centers. The question of what happened to the Nabataean people after the Roman annexation, and what the relationship is between the ancient Nabataean civilization and the peoples and cultures of the modern Arabian Peninsula, is one that touches on some of the most interesting and contested issues in the history of the region. The simplest answer is that the Nabataeans did not disappear. They were absorbed, over several generations, into the broader population of the Roman Near East, and through that population into the Arabic-speaking world that emerged in the region in the first millennium of the Common Era. The Nabataean script, developed in the centuries of the kingdom's flourishing, is the direct ancestor of the Arabic script. The letter forms of the classical Arabic alphabet are derived from the Nabataean letter forms through a process of gradual transformation that can be traced through the inscriptions of the intermediate centuries. The connection between the Nabataean script and the Arabic script is one of the clearest pieces of evidence for the cultural continuity between the Nabataean world and the Arabic-speaking world that followed it. The relationship between the Nabataean language and the Arabic language is more complex. Nabataean was a form of Aramaic, the international diplomatic and commercial language of the Near East in the first millennium before the Common Era, and it was distinct from the pre-Islamic Arabic dialects that were spoken in the Arabian Peninsula at the same time. But the close contact between the Aramaic-speaking Nabataeans and the Arabic-speaking peoples of the peninsula, over many centuries of trade and intermarriage and cultural exchange, produced a situation of considerable linguistic complexity in which the boundary between Nabataean and Arabic was probably less sharp in practice than the formal linguistic categories suggest. The linguistic legacy of the Nabataeans in the Arabic-speaking world is one of the most interesting and most debated aspects of their cultural inheritance. The Arabic spoken today in the Hejaz and throughout the Arabian Peninsula descends not from Nabataean, which was a form of Aramaic, but from the pre-Islamic Arabic dialects that were spoken in the peninsula alongside Nabataean during the period of the kingdom's existence. But the cultural and commercial contact between Nabataean speakers and Arabic speakers over several centuries produced a situation in which elements of each tradition influenced the other, and the people who inhabited the Hejaz after the dissolution of the Nabataean kingdom were the heirs of both traditions in a way that makes the boundary between them more a scholarly convenience than a historical reality. The specific question of whether the Nabataeans left any cultural legacy at Hegra that can be traced in the history of the region through the centuries of the Islamic period is a complex one. The site of Hegra is located in what is now the Hejaz region of Saudi Arabia, the region through which the Islamic pilgrimage routes pass and in which Mecca and Medina are situated, and the history of this region in the centuries between the Roman annexation and the emergence of Islam in the 7th century of the Common Era is poorly documented. The local traditions of the Hejaz certainly maintained knowledge of the ancient ruins, and the Islamic tradition's complex relationship with the pre-Islamic past of the Arabian Peninsula gave the Hegra monuments a particular significance that shaped how they were understood and treated in the medieval and early modern periods. The Islamic tradition contains references to what it calls the people of the Hijr, the Arabic name for the Hegra site, in the Quran itself, where they are associated with the people of the mud, a people whom God punished for their disobedience. The identification of the Nabataean tombs with the people of the mud has had significant consequences for the history of the site in the Islamic period, contributing to an attitude of avoidance toward the monuments that may have limited both settlement at and damage to the site through much of the medieval period. The rediscovery of Hegra by the outside world and its emergence as a major archaeological site is a process that has accelerated dramatically in recent decades, and the story of that rediscovery is inseparable from the story of how the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has been engaging with its pre-Islamic archaeological heritage. The first European descriptions of Hegra date to the 19th century, when a handful of European travelers, most notably the Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt in 1812 and the British explorer Charles Doughty in the 1870s, made their way to the site and produced descriptions and drawings that introduced it to a European scholarly audience. These early accounts were remarkable for their time, produced under conditions of considerable hardship and in a region that was deeply inhospitable to Western travelers, but they were necessarily limited in their scope and their systematic documentation of the monuments. The systematic archaeological investigation of Hegra, which is required to understand the site in its full complexity, is a much more recent development. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has historically been cautious about foreign access to archaeological sites on the Arabian Peninsula, and the investigation of pre-Islamic sites in particular was complicated by the religious and cultural sensitivities associated with the Quranic references to the people of the mud and their identification with the Hegra monuments. The gradual opening of the country to archaeological investigation accelerated significantly in recent years as part of the Saudi government's Vision 2030 program of economic and cultural diversification has transformed the situation. The French archaeological mission that has been working at Hegra since the early 2000s, in collaboration with Saudi institutions, has produced the most comprehensive and systematic documentation of the site that has ever been undertaken. This work has included the detailed recording and analysis of all the major tomb facades, the excavation of portions of the living city, the survey of the wider landscape of the Al-Yala Valley, and the scientific analysis of the physical remains of the monuments. The results of this work have significantly transformed the understanding of the site and of the Nabataean civilization that created it. The scale of the transformation at Al-Yala in recent years is difficult to overstate. The region, which was accessible only to specialists and occasional adventure travelers a decade ago, has been connected to the international tourism infrastructure through new airports, luxury hotels designed to minimal environmental impact in the desert landscape, and a program of cultural events and installations that has brought artists and performers to what was recently one of the most remote and least visited heritage landscapes in the world. The speed of this transformation raises questions about the long-term implications for the physical fabric of the ancient site and for the cultural and natural landscape of the valley, questions that the management authorities are actively grappling with even as the development continues. The announcement by the Saudi government in 2020 that Hegra had been inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, becoming the first such site in Saudi Arabia, marked a significant moment in the engagement of the kingdom with its archaeological heritage. The inscription was accompanied by a major program of tourism infrastructure development, with new facilities for visitors, improved access to the site, and the development of interpretive materials that present the monuments and their history to an international audience. The pace of change at the site since the inscription has been rapid, and the transformation of Hegra from a largely unknown site visited by a handful of specialists each year to an internationally recognized destination attracting tens of thousands of visitors is still in its early stages. The experience of visiting Hegra today is one that has changed significantly with the recent development of tourism infrastructure, and it offers a combination of archaeological richness and visual drama that is unlike anything available at more familiar ancient sites. The approach to the site across the desert plain gives the visitor a first impression of the sandstone outcrops rising from the flat desert floor, their forms rounded and worn by millennia of wind erosion, their surfaces the deep orange and red and cream of layered desert sandstone. The scale of the outcrops is difficult to judge at a distance, and it is only as the approach continues and the carved facades become visible as dark rectangular shapes in the rock faces that the size of the monuments begins to register. Up close, the facades are overwhelming in their detail. The carved columns and their capitals, the decorative moldings of the entablature, the Medusa heads and eagles of the frieze, the dedicatory inscription above the doorway, all executed with a precision that the dry desert air has preserved almost intact for 2,000 years. The contrast between the elaborate decoration of the facade and the simplicity of the burial chamber behind it is one of the most striking aspects of the Hegra tombs. The facade was the monument, the public statement of the tomb owner's status and wealth, and the legal marker of the burial rite. The chamber behind it was simply a repository for the dead, a cave-like space cut into the rock with no decorative elaboration, its walls lined with loculi, the niches cut into the rock to receive individual interments, and its floor littered with the skeletal remains and the grave goods that accumulated over the years of the tomb's active use. The contrast between the performance of the exterior and the austerity of the interior reflects a funerary ideology in which the display of status was directed outward, toward the living world that the dead had left behind, rather than inward, toward the dead themselves. The best preserved and most elaborate of the Hegra tombs, those concentrated on the major outcrops in the central part of the site, are accessible to visitors through guided tours that take groups through the main clusters of monuments. The largest of these, a facade known as the Tomb of Lihian son of Kuza, rises approximately 22 meters from its base and is decorated with an elaborate program of carved ornament that includes 4 freestanding columns with Nabataean capitals, a frieze of multiple registers with eagles and Medusa heads and decorative moldings, and a stepped crown with cavetto cornice that gives the facade its characteristic silhouette against the desert sky. The wider landscape of the Alula Valley, within which the Hegra archaeological zone is embedded, adds another dimension to the experience of the site. The date palm oases of the valley floor, which have been cultivated for thousands of years and which give the valley its quality of unexpected fertility in the surrounding desert, the dramatic sandstone cliffs of the valley walls, and the evidence of successive human occupation from the prehistoric period to the Islamic era that is present throughout the landscape, make Hegra part of a broader historical palimpsest rather than an isolated monument. The Nabataean achievement at Hegra is most fully understood when it is placed in the context of the broader Nabataean cultural tradition, and particularly in comparison with Petra, the principal city of the Nabataean kingdom that shares many of the same architectural and cultural characteristics while differing significantly in scale and in the specific circumstances of its history and preservation. Petra is larger, more elaborate, and more famous than Hegra. Its treasury facade, the image most commonly associated with the Nabataeans in the popular imagination, is one of the most photographed architectural monuments in the world. Its scale, with hundreds of rock-cut monuments distributed across a landscape of extraordinary geological drama, makes it one of the most impressive ancient sites anywhere on Earth. The comparison with Hegra is therefore inevitably one in which Hegra appears as the smaller and less spectacular sibling. But the comparison also reveals something important about what makes Hegra significant in its own right, and not simply as a satellite of Petra. The Hegra monuments are in many respects better preserved than their Petra counterparts, partly because the drier climate of the Hejaz is more favorable for the preservation of carved sandstone than the climate of southern Jordan, and partly because the relative inaccessibility of Hegra through most of its post-Nabataean history protected it from the kind of sustained human activity that has damaged many of the Petra monuments. The inscriptions at Hegra are better preserved, the carved ornamental details are sharper, and the overall condition of the major facades is in some cases superior to their equivalents at Petra. The pottery tradition of the Nabataeans is another area where the comparison between Hegra and Petra is instructive. The thin-walled painted pottery that is one of the most distinctive products of Nabataean craft production, its walls sometimes as thin as 1 millimeter and decorated with delicate painted plant motifs, is found throughout the Nabataean world and is one of the clearest material markers of Nabataean cultural identity. At Hegra, as at Petra, this pottery is found alongside the imported wares that document the city's connection to the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern trading world, and the combination of local production and imported goods in the archaeological assemblages of both cities reflects the cosmopolitan character of the Nabataean commercial civilization. The specific character of Hegra within the Nabataean world is also worth understanding on its own terms. Hegra was not simply a miniature Petra but a city with its own specific role in the Nabataean kingdom and its own specific character as a funerary landscape. The concentration of funerary monuments relative to civic architecture is higher at Hegra than at Petra, reflecting the specific importance of Hegra as a prestigious burial ground for the Nabataean elite. The inscriptions at Hegra include some of the most detailed and legally sophisticated examples of Nabataean funerary epigraphy anywhere in the Nabataean world, reflecting the legal culture of a community in which the rights of the dead were a matter of serious public concern. The caravan trade that was the economic foundation of both Petra and Hegra connected the two cities to a much wider world, and the material culture of Hegra reflects the international connections that this trade brought. The pottery found in excavations at the site includes vessels from Egypt, from the Levant, from the broader Hellenistic world, alongside the characteristically thin-walled painted Nabataean pottery that is one of the most distinctive products of Nabataean craft tradition. The presence of these imported goods at a site deep in the Arabian desert is a reminder that the ancient world was more connected and more cosmopolitan than is sometimes assumed. The archaeology of Hegra is still at a relatively early stage compared to more intensively studied ancient sites, and there are significant aspects of the site's history and character that remain incompletely understood or entirely unknown. The relationship between the tombs and the living city of Hegra is one of the most important areas of ongoing research. The tombs are the best preserved and most studied component of the site, but they represent only one dimension of a complex urban organism that also included a residential population, a commercial infrastructure, civic institutions, and a religious life that went beyond the funerary practices documented by the tomb inscriptions. The excavation of the living city, which has been proceeding slowly and carefully since the early work of the French mission began in the 2000s, has produced important new information but has also revealed the complexity of the stratigraphy of the site. With multiple phases of occupation from the Nabataean period through the late Antique and early Islamic periods superimposed on each other in ways that require careful excavation and analysis to disentangle. The question of the relationship between Hegra and the other settlements of the Al-Yala Valley is another area where the research is still developing. The Al-Yala Valley has been inhabited for thousands of years, and the evidence of pre-Nabataean occupation in the valley, including the remains of earlier Arabian civilizations that preceded the Nabataeans in the region, is significant but incompletely documented. The Lyhayanite kingdom, which was the dominant political power in the Al-Yala area before the Nabataean expansion into the region, has left its own inscriptions and architectural remains that need to be understood in relationship to the Nabataean material. The environmental history of the Hegra area is another important area of research that is beginning to produce significant results. The paleoclimatological evidence from the region suggests that the climate of northwestern Saudi Arabia was somewhat wetter in the first millennium before the Common Era than it is today, with implications for the agricultural productivity and the carrying capacity of the landscape that need to be integrated into the understanding of how Hegra functioned as a settlement. The wetter conditions that may have prevailed during the period of the Nabataean kingdom would have meant more reliable water sources, more productive agriculture in the valley floors, and a greater capacity to support the population of merchants, administrators, and craftspeople that the tomb inscriptions suggest was present at the site. The gradual desiccation of the regional climate over the past 2 millennia, a process that has been documented at other sites in the Arabian Peninsula, may have been a factor in the long-term decline of settlement at Hegra after the Roman annexation, compounding the political and economic factors that reduced the commercial importance of the site. The evidence for the management of water resources at the site, including the cisterns and dams and conduits of the Nabataean water system, needs to be understood in the context of this environmental history as well as in the context of the Nabataean engineering tradition. The scientific analysis of the human remains from the Hegra tombs, which represent the actual bodies of the people whose names are recorded in the inscriptions, has the potential to provide important new information about the population of the ancient city, including information about their diet, their health, their origins, and their relationship to the broader population of the ancient Near East. The analysis of this material, which requires careful scientific work under appropriate regulatory frameworks, is one of the most promising areas of future research at the site. The broader significance of Hegra in the history of the ancient world is not limited to what it tells us about the Nabataeans specifically, but extends to larger questions about the nature of the ancient Arabian Peninsula and its role in the civilizational history of the region. The Arabian Peninsula is often treated in ancient history as a peripheral region, a desert landscape at the edge of the more densely settled and more intensively studied civilizations of the Mediterranean and the Near East. This treatment reflects the biases of the ancient sources, which were mostly produced by Mediterranean and Near Eastern writers who had limited knowledge of and limited interest in the interior of the peninsula, and it has been reinforced by the relative difficulty of archaeological work in the region and by the historical circumstances that limited access to the peninsula for much of the modern period. But it is fundamentally misleading. The Arabian Peninsula was not peripheral to the ancient world but central to it in specific and important ways. It was the source of frankincense and myrrh, the luxury goods most in demand across the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, and the routes that carried these goods northward were among the most economically significant in the ancient world. It was the point of connection between the Mediterranean world and the Indian Ocean trading system, and the goods that moved along its coasts and through its interior linked the civilizations of the Mediterranean with those of South Asia and East Africa in a network of exchange that shaped the economic and cultural history of the ancient world in ways that are still being understood. The Nabataeans, as the people who controlled the key segment of these routes from their kingdom in the Hejaz and the Negev, were not peripheral actors in this world but central ones. Hegra specifically was a city at one of the most important junctions in this network of connections, and the evidence from the site reflects the international character of the ancient trading world in concrete and specific ways. The mixed material culture of the excavations, with its combination of local Nabataean production and imported goods from across the ancient world, is a material record of the cosmopolitan reality of a city that sat at the crossing of routes linking Arabia, the Near East, and the Mediterranean. The tomb inscriptions, with their mix of Nabataean personal names and names derived from Arabic, Greek, and other linguistic traditions, reflect the social diversity of a community that was part of an international commercial network. The role of Hegra in the history of the Arabic script, as one of the sites where inscriptions in the Nabataean script have been found that document the transition toward the letterforms that would eventually become the classical Arabic alphabet, gives the site an additional significance in the history of writing and of human communication. The Arabic script is used today by hundreds of millions of people as the primary script for Arabic and many other languages, and the chain of development that connects the Nabataean inscriptions of Hegra to the Arabic of the Quran and of the modern world is one of the more remarkable cultural threads in the history of the region. The conservation of the Hegra tombs presents challenges that are specific to the desert environment and to the specific materials and construction techniques of the monuments, and the development of conservation strategies appropriate to the site has been an important component of the recent work at Hegra. The primary threat to the carved stone of the Hegra facades is not biological growth or water infiltration, as it would be for monuments in a wetter climate, but the physical and chemical processes associated with the desert environment itself. Salt weathering, the process by which soluble salts crystallize within the pores of the sandstone as the surface temperature cycles between the heat of the day and the cold of the night, is one of the most damaging processes affecting the carved surfaces. The salts, which are present both in the sandstone itself and in the wind-blown particles that coat the surface, expand as they crystallize and exert forces within the stone that can progressively detach the surface layer and destroy the carved detail beneath it. The characteristic granular disintegration of the sandstone surface that is visible on many of the Hegra facades, particularly in the lower portions most exposed to wind-blown sand and salt, is the product of this process operating over many centuries. The management of tourist access to the monuments is another significant conservation challenge that has become more urgent with the recent increase in visitor numbers. The physical contact of visitors with the carved surfaces, whether through touching or inadvertent abrasion, accelerates the surface deterioration that is already occurring through natural processes. The development of access routes and viewing arrangements that allow visitors to appreciate the monuments at close range without touching the carved surfaces is a design challenge that requires careful attention to the specific vulnerabilities of each monument. The documentation of the current condition of the monuments, as the baseline against which future changes can be measured and as the record that will be essential if conservation treatment is needed, has been one of the priorities of the recent archaeological work at the site. The application of photogrammetric recording techniques to the tomb facades, producing three-dimensional models of the carved surfaces at millimeter accuracy, provides both a permanent record of the current condition and a tool for monitoring future changes. The combination of this digital documentation with traditional archaeological recording has produced the most comprehensive record of the Hegra monuments ever assembled. The question of how to present the monuments to visitors in a way that communicates both their physical character and their historical significance is one that the developing tourism infrastructure at the site is still working through. The development of interpretive materials that place the individual tombs in their historical and cultural context, that explain the significance of the inscriptions and the architectural forms to visitors who may have no prior knowledge of the Nabataeans or of the history of the region, is essential for the experience of the site to be meaningful rather than simply visually impressive. The challenge is to do this in a way that respects the integrity of the monuments and the significance of the site as a place of cultural heritage for the people of Saudi Arabia as well as for the international audience that the UNESCO inscription has brought to it. The story of the Nabataean civilization, from its origins among the nomadic peoples of the Arabian desert to its absorption into the Roman Empire and its eventual transformation into the foundations of the Arabic-speaking world, is one of the more remarkable stories in the history of the ancient Near East. It is remarkable partly for the speed of the transformation. Within 3 or 4 centuries, a people described in the ancient sources as nomads who would not plant seeds or build houses had built one of the most sophisticated urban civilizations in the ancient world, with a unique architectural tradition, a script that would become the ancestor of the Arabic alphabet, and a commercial network that connected the Arabian Peninsula to the Mediterranean world in a relationship of mutual economic dependence. This speed of cultural transformation, which has parallels in the history of other nomadic peoples who made the transition to settled urban life, reflects both the specific economic opportunity that the incense trade provided and the capacity of the Nabataean people to exploit that opportunity with extraordinary energy and intelligence. It is remarkable partly for what it produced. The great tomb facades of Petra and Hegra, which stand among the most visually powerful monuments of the ancient world, the Nabataean script, which was the vehicle for a rich epigraphic tradition and which became the ancestor of the Arabic script, the Nabataean water management technology, which allowed settled life in desert environments that were otherwise uninhabitable, and the trading network that made the Nabataean kingdom one of the wealthiest states in the Near East during its period of greatest flourishing. The speed and thoroughness of the Nabataean cultural synthesis is worth dwelling on, because it is easy to underestimate what was achieved in the 3 or 4 centuries between the first appearance of the Nabataeans in the historical sources and the creation of the great monuments at Petra and Hegra. In those centuries, a people who had no tradition of monumental stone construction developed one of the most distinctive architectural vocabularies in the ancient world. A people who had no tradition of urban administration developed the institutional structures of a sophisticated city-state. A people who had no tradition of long-distance commercial organization became the controllers of one of the most important trading networks in the ancient world. This is not a story of a people who simply adopted the practices of their neighbors, but a story of a people who took elements from multiple surrounding traditions and made something genuinely new from the combination. And it is remarkable partly for the manner of its ending, not in conquest and destruction, not in a catastrophic military defeat or a sudden collapse, but in a gradual absorption into a larger civilization that preserved many of the elements of Nabataean culture even as it dissolved the specifically Nabataean political and institutional framework. The Nabataean script became the Arabic script. The Nabataean trade routes became the roads of the Roman province and later the pilgrimage routes of the Islamic world. The Nabataean knowledge of the desert, of its water sources and its seasonal rhythms and its commercial opportunities, was transmitted to the peoples who came after them and who continued to exploit the same environment in many of the same ways. The tombs of Hegra are, in this context, more than monuments to the dead. They are monuments to a way of engaging with the world that had deep roots in the landscape of the Arabian desert and that survived the dissolution of the political structures that had most visibly expressed it. The Nabataean civilization ended. The Nabataean capacity for synthesis, for combining elements from different cultural traditions into something new and powerful and distinctively their own, did not end with it. The relationship between Hegra and the broader history of the Alula Valley is one that extends far beyond the Nabataean period, and the site needs to be understood as part of a landscape of continuous human occupation that has been reshaping itself for thousands of years. The Alula Valley was inhabited long before the Nabataeans arrived. The inscriptions and monuments of the Lihayanite kingdom, which was the dominant political power in the region in the centuries before the Nabataean expansion, are present throughout the valley and particularly concentrated at the ancient site of Dedan, located a few kilometers south of the main Hegra archaeological zone. The Lihayianites left a rich epigraphic legacy in their own distinct script, and their monuments and inscriptions add another layer to the already complex cultural palimpsest of the valley. The relationship between the Lihayanite and Nabataean occupations of the valley, and the question of what happened to the Lihayanite population when the Nabataeans took control of the region, are areas of active archaeological investigation. Before the Lihayianites, there is evidence of still earlier human occupation in the valley and the surrounding landscape, from the prehistoric rock art that covers many of the sandstone surfaces throughout the region to the Bronze Age and Iron Age settlements whose remains are present in the archaeological record. The rock art is particularly striking, covering the sandstone surfaces of the valley walls and the outcrops with images of animals, human figures, and abstract symbols that span thousands of years of human presence and that provide a visual record of the changing fauna and the changing human activities of the region across a very long time period. The Islamic period occupation of the Alula Valley, which continued the long tradition of settlement in this fertile corridor through the desert, has left its own layer of monuments and inscriptions that testify to the importance of the valley as a stop on the pilgrimage route from Syria and Iraq to Mecca. The medieval town of Alula, which was inhabited until the 1980s, when its residents moved to a modern settlement nearby, is one of the best preserved examples of traditional Arabian vernacular architecture in the Hijaz, and its preservation alongside the ancient monuments of the valley creates a landscape in which several thousand years of human history are simultaneously visible. The rock art of the Alula Valley and the broader Hijaz region is one of the most extensive and most visually striking bodies of prehistoric art in the Arabian Peninsula, and its study has been significantly advanced by the recent increase in archaeological attention to the region. The images carved and painted on the sandstone surfaces of the valley walls and outcrops include representations of animals, many of them species that no longer inhabit the region, that provide evidence for the environmental history of the Hijaz across thousands of years. The hunting scenes and the images of domestic animals that appear in the rock art alongside the wild species document the transition from hunter-gatherer economies to pastoral and agricultural ones in a record that is both visually immediate and chronologically deep. The development of the Alula region as a cultural and tourism destination, which has accelerated significantly since the Saudi government's designation of the area as a major heritage and tourism zone, is creating new opportunities and new challenges for the management of this layered historical landscape. The need to make the monuments accessible and meaningful to an international tourist audience while preserving their physical integrity and their significance for the local and national communities that understand them as part of their own heritage is the central challenge of heritage management in the Alula Valley, as it is at heritage sites throughout the world. The sound of the desert at Hegra, and the quality of the silence that underlies it, is one of the aspects of the site that distinguishes the experience of visiting it from the experience of any more crowded or more vegetated ancient site. The desert is not silent in the way that popular imagination sometimes suggests. The wind moves through the sandstone outcrops in ways that produce sounds. The low resonance of air moving through the openings of the tomb chambers, the higher note of wind deflecting off the sharp edges of the carved facades, the occasional creak and settle of rock that is still slowly changing shape under the influence of thermal expansion and contraction. The birds that nest in the sandstone outcrops, The ravens and the desert larks and the various species of dove that are characteristic of the Hejaz Desert call throughout the day and particularly in the early morning when the air is still cool. The occasional passage of a camel caravan, still a reality in this part of Saudi Arabia despite the modernity of the surrounding infrastructure, adds a sound that the ancient travelers who passed through this landscape would have recognized immediately. But underneath these sounds, the desert has a quality of stillness that is genuinely unusual and that is felt as a physical presence rather than simply as the absence of noise. The air is dry and clear, and the sounds that do exist carry further than they would in a wetter environment, but they are widely spaced in time and in the soundscape, and the intervals between them have a depth and a completeness that the soundscapes of wetter and more densely populated landscapes rarely achieve. The Nabataean tomb carvers who worked on the facades of Hegra 2,000 years ago would have heard something very similar to what the visitor hears today, and the quality of that acoustic environment would have been part of the experience of being at the site from the beginning. The light of the desert at Hegra is equally distinctive. The clarity of the air at this altitude and in this climate allows the light to fall on the carved sandstone surfaces with an intensity and a precision that reveals details invisible in the diffused light of a wetter environment. The shadows cast by the carved moldings and capitals of the tomb facades are sharp and deep, and the relationship between light and shadow changes hour by hour and season by season in ways that give the same facade a completely different visual character at different times of day. The Nabataean architects who designed the facades were certainly aware of this quality of the desert light and may have designed the depth and angle of the carved details specifically to exploit the dramatic shadow effects that the desert sun produces. The heat of the day in summer, when temperatures can reach 50 degrees Celsius in the exposed desert, is another aspect of the desert environment that shapes the experience of the site in ways that the ancient inhabitants would have felt as acutely as modern visitors do. The timing of activity at the site, concentrated in the cooler hours of the early morning and the late afternoon, is not a modern accommodation to visitor comfort but a continuation of the pattern that has always governed life in the desert, and the experience of watching the light change on the tomb facades in the hour after sunrise or the hour before sunset, when the raking light of the low sun brings out the maximum detail of the carved surfaces, is one of the most memorable that the site offers. The question of what the Nabataeans believed about death, and how those beliefs shaped the elaborate funerary monuments they created at Hegra, is one that the evidence allows us to approach only partially, but it is worth approaching because it touches on the most fundamental dimension of what the tombs were for. The Nabataean inscriptions at Hegra are relatively reticent about the specifics of funerary belief. They record the legal arrangements of the burial rite, the names of the dead and the gods, and the practical details of who may use the tomb and on what terms. They do not describe what the Nabataeans believed happened to the dead after burial, what kind of existence the dead were thought to enjoy or endure, or what the relationship between the living and the dead was understood to be in the religious framework of the Nabataean world. For this, we must draw on the broader evidence of Nabataean religious practice and on the parallels with the funerary beliefs of the neighboring cultures of the ancient Near East. The practice of constructing elaborate tomb facades that were clearly designed to be seen and admired by the living, rather than simply to protect the remains of the dead, suggests a funerary ideology in which the visibility of the tomb in the landscape of the living was an important consideration. The dead person's continued existence in the memory and the awareness of the living, maintained through the visible monument that bore their name and their title and the legal record of their burial rite, may have been part of what the Nabataean elite understood as the appropriate form of immortality that their wealth and status entitled them to. The tomb was a declaration. I was here, I was important, and I arranged things so that this fact would be legible in this landscape for as long as the stone endures. The triclinia, the dining rooms carved adjacent to the tomb facades, add another dimension to the picture of Nabataean funerary practice. The practice of eating ritual meals at or near the tombs of the dead, which is documented at both Hegra and Petra, reflects the widespread ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern belief that the dead required nourishment and that the living had an obligation to provide it through periodic offerings and commemorative meals. The living and the dead ate together, metaphorically if not literally, in the triclinium adjacent to the tomb, and this shared meal maintained the connection between the generations that was a fundamental element of ancient Near Eastern religious and social life. The invocation of divine protection in the tomb inscriptions, the naming of Dushara or Alat as the deity whose punishment would fall on anyone who violated the burial rite, reflects a belief in the continued effectiveness of divine power in protecting the interests of the dead after their burial. The dead were not simply gone. They retained a legal personality that could be protected by divine sanction, and the gods of the living were also the gods of the dead in a way that made the tomb inscription a contract not just between the tomb owner and future generations of the living, but between the human community and the divine world that upheld the legal and moral order of both. The legacy of Hegra in the contemporary world is being actively constructed at a speed and at a scale that makes this one of the more dynamic heritage sites in the world today, and the process of that construction raises important questions about how ancient sites are interpreted and managed in the modern world. The Saudi government's decision to invest heavily in the development of Hegra as an international tourism destination, through the creation of the Al-Ula Development Authority and the associated infrastructure projects, represents a significant commitment to engaging with the pre-Islamic heritage of the Arabian Peninsula in a new way. The Hegra monuments, which were for centuries understood primarily through the lens of the Quranic references to the people of the mud, are now being presented to international and domestic audiences through the framework of global archaeological heritage, with an emphasis on the Nabataean civilization's sophistication, its international connections, and its contribution to the cultural history of the Arabian Peninsula. This reframing is not without its complexities. The relationship between the archaeological heritage of the Nabataean period and the Islamic heritage of the same landscape, and the question of how to present pre-Islamic monuments to a domestic Saudi audience in a way that is both historically accurate and culturally sensitive, is one that the developers and managers of the Al-Ula Heritage Zone are navigating in real time. The rapid development of the tourism infrastructure at the site, which has brought significant physical changes to the landscape of the Al-Ula Valley in a very short period of time, has also raised questions about the balance between development and conservation that are not unique to Hegra but are felt with particular acuteness given the speed of the changes underway. The specific question of how to present the Quranic references to the people of the mud in the context of the Hegra heritage tourism experience is one that the managers of the site are navigating with evident care. The standard approach in the interpretive materials available at the site acknowledges the Quranic references without foregrounding them in a way that would discourage engagement with the archaeological heritage, presenting the ancient Nabataean civilization as a historical phenomenon of intrinsic interest while respecting the religious significance of the site in the Islamic tradition. The balance that results is necessarily imperfect, but it reflects a genuine attempt to engage with the complexity of a site that carries multiple and sometimes conflicting layers of meaning for different audiences. The international scholarly community's engagement with Hegra has also been transformed by the opening of the site to research, and the collaborative projects between Saudi institutions and international research teams that have been established in recent years are producing new knowledge about the site at a rate that would not have been possible under the more restricted access conditions of previous decades. The integration of this new knowledge into the interpretation of the site for visitors and into the broader scholarly understanding of the Nabataean world and the history of the Arabian Peninsula is one of the most productive ongoing conversations in Near Eastern archaeology. The silence of Hegra is the silence of the desert, and it is a silence that has been working on the monuments for 2,000 years. It is not the silence of concealment that covered Tikal, where the jungle grew over and through the buildings and hid them from the world. It is not the silence of submersion that preserved Thonis Heraclean, where the sea sealed the city in its depths. It is not the silence of the mountain that sheltered Vardzia, where the carved rooms of the cliff face survived behind their stone walls. The silence of Hegra is more open, more exposed. The silence of monuments that have been visible in the landscape since the day they were finished, that have been seen by every traveler who passed through this desert valley in the 2 millennia since the last Nabataean carved the last inscription above the last doorway, and that have survived not through concealment but through the specific properties of the desert environment that preserves what it does not destroy. The desert destroys selectively. It destroys the mud brick of the domestic quarters, the organic materials of the everyday life of the city, the thin plaster of the domestic walls, the timber of the roofs and lintels. It preserves the stone of the tomb facades, their carved surfaces protected by the hard crust that forms on exposed sandstone in dry conditions, their interiors sealed against the moisture that would otherwise accelerate deterioration. The city of the living has almost entirely vanished. The city of the dead is still standing. This selective preservation is itself a kind of statement, though not one that the Nabataeans intended. They built the tombs to last, and in this specific environment the tombs have lasted. They built the residential quarters without the expectation of permanence, and in this specific environment the residential quarters have not lasted. The result is a city in which only the funerary dimension of the ancient community is physically present, a city in which death has outlasted life in the most literal material sense. Whether this is a coincidence of materials and climate, or whether the Nabataeans understood something about the desert that made them invest so heavily in the only kind of construction that would survive it, is a question that the evidence does not fully answer. The tombs stand in the desert as they have stood for 2,000 years, their facades facing outward across the landscape, their inscriptions still legible in the dry air, their empty chambers awaiting visitors who will never again come to them for the purpose for which they were built. The dead are gone. The names remain, carved in stone that outlasts all memory of the people who bore them, a record of a civilization that understood its own mortality well enough to invest everything in making sure it would not be forgotten. The desert that preserved the tombs also preserved the landscape in which they were built. The view from the major outcrop clusters at Hegra is still broadly the view that the Nabataean tomb carvers would have seen when they paused in their work, the flat desert plain extending to the sandstone mountains on the horizon, the quality of the light and the silence and the scale of the empty sky unchanged by the 2 millennia that have passed. This continuity of the natural landscape, so different from the landscapes of the other lost cities in this series where the forest or the sea or the accumulated construction of later ages has transformed the setting of the ancient monuments beyond recognition, gives Hegra a quality of temporal compression that is unique to the desert world. Standing before one of the great tomb facades of Hegra in the late afternoon, when the sun is low and the raking light brings out every detail of the carved surfaces in strong relief, the 2,000 years of distance between the present and the moment of the facade's completion seems to collapse in a specific and unusual way. The facade is complete. It is not a fragment or a ruin in the conventional sense. The columns are still standing. The entablature is largely intact. The carved ornament of the frieze, the eagles with their spread wings, the Medusa heads with their serpent hair, the scrolling vegetation of the moldings, is still as crisp as the hands of the Nabataean carvers left it when they finished their work. The dedicatory inscription above the door, recording the name of the tomb owner and the date of construction and the names of the gods whose protection was invoked, is still legible. The whole ensemble, facade and inscription and architectural ornament, is still communicating what it was designed to communicate, still performing the function of memorial and legal marker and status declaration that it was built to perform. The door behind the inscription is closed, or rather it is empty where once there would have been a stone door, and the chamber beyond is dark and stripped of the bones and the grave goods that were once placed there. The dead for whom all of this was built are gone in a way that the monument that was built for them is not gone. The elaborate stone performance of the facade continues. The specific human presence that justified and commissioned it has ceased. This disjunction, between the monument that persists and the person that it was built to memorialize, is felt with particular force at Hegra because the monument is in such good condition. There are no obvious signs of the passage of time on the major facades, no visible deterioration that would help the viewer calibrate the distance between the present and the past. The Nabataean tomb carver who finished this facade 2,000 years ago and stepped back to look at his work would see more or less what the visitor sees today, and the continuity of that visual experience across 2 millennia is the most powerful argument that the Nabataeans succeeded in what they were trying to do. The desert stretches away from the outcrops in every direction, flat and pale and largely empty under the enormous sky. The sandstone mountains on the horizon are the same mountains that the tomb carvers could see when they paused in their work and looked up. The silence between the bird calls and the wind is the same silence they heard. The light on the stone is the same light, falling at the same angles at the same hours of the same desert days. What is missing from this landscape is not the monuments but the people, the living community that the monuments were built to impress and to outlast, the merchants and the officials and the caravan drivers and the priests who once moved through this valley and looked at these facades and understood exactly what they meant. If this film has kept you company through the night, consider subscribing so you never miss the next quiet journey. And if you are ready for another story from the ancient world, there is one waiting for you on the screen now.